Hi everyone, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. The sugya that we'll be dealing with today, which is on Menachot Daf Kaf Aleph, and ultimately what we'll be talking about is the Kohan participation of the Cohanim in machatzit hashekel, the donation to the temple treasuries, will be ultimately take us to a conversation about the nature of community and the way that halakha thinks about what kind of entity community is. Is community simply a collection or a conglomerate of individuals joined together for a specific purpose? Or is it really an entity in its own right that whose identity exists sort of beyond and independent from the individuals who make it up? And that'll take us into some interesting halakhic questions that actually emerge from this sugya that might also depend on really how we think that halakha thinks about that question. So let's get started. We're on Menachot Daf Kaf Aleph in a conversation really about the melach brought the melach that's put on korbanot for Cohanim, whether Cohanim can use melach shel hekdesh, right, that belongs to the sort of communal temple pot of melach, or whether they would theoretically need to bring their own, and their ability to use public salt is actually due to a t'nai of the Beit Din, to a kind of condition that the Beit Din makes to allow for them to use the melach of hekdesh. So in the context of that discussion, Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi, or he brings the context from a different mishnah to shed light on this question. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi hachi ka'amar Rav Shisha bereder Rav Idi lo nitzurcha ela leven buchri. So Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi in the shame of Rav Shisha bereder Rav Idi that actually this position, the position of the t'nai of the Beit Din, really is only relevant for or necessary for one particular position in the Tanaim, that of Ben Bukhari. And then he goes on to quote, we go on to quote a mishnah from Eduyot in which we see a machloket between Ben Bukhari and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai about the role of Cohanim and their contribution or not to the machatzit hashekel. So, and this mishnah is really going to be what we're dealing with for the rest of the day. So, Titnan, Amar Rav Yehuda, Hi'id ben Bukhari b'Yavne kol kohen sheshokel eino chotet. So, Rabbi Yehuda says that Ben Bukhari testified in Yavne that every kohen who contributes to machatzit hashekel eino chotet, which is to say the contribution is optional, not mandatory, but also not a problem. So, just a quick kind of little bit of context here. Machatzit hashekel, right? We know it originally from Parashat Kitisa, from Parashat Shekalim, that we'll be reading fairly soon. Every year, Bnei Yisrael would, or at least the 20-year-old up males of Bnei Yisrael would contribute machatzit hashekel, which would ultimately go to public funding for the korbanot for the coming year. And the question that the Mishnah is dealing with here is whether or not Cohanim were included in that contribution, whether or not they were also expected or permitted to contribute. So Ben Bukhari says that's okay. It's optional. They can, but they don't have to. Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai lo ki ela kol kohen she'eino shokel choteh. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says no, it's mandatory. They've got to do it. Yet what seems like there was a common practice of the Cohanim not contributing. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is coming to explain what was going on there. Ela sheha-kohanim dorshim mikra zeh atzma. Rather, the Cohanim are darshaning this pasuk for themselves, incorrectly it seems. V'chol minchat kohen kalil tihyeh lo te'achel. Right, we know that a mincha of a kohen is meant to be entirely burned and not to be consumed or eaten. But we've got a problem, which is that the korbanot tzibbur, there are many menachot of the tzibbur that are meant to be eaten. Ho'il the omer ushtei halechem v'lechem hapanim shelanu hi he'ach ne'echalin. The Kohanim are saying, look, if we contribute to these public this public pot of funds that ultimately is with which we are ultimately going to purchase the omer and the shtei halechem and the lechem hapanim, all of which are menachot and all of which are meant to be eaten. Well, then if they're going to be partially ours, then how will it be permissible for them to be eaten? Therefore, it must be that we're not supposed to contribute to the public pot. So that's the drasha that the Cohanim are darshaning la'atzman. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, they've got it wrong. They really are must contribute. So now we're going to see a couple of different takes on the various positions in the Mishnah and what they're about and what they're coming to exclude or what they're worried about. So first, let's start with Rashi trying to understand Ben Buchri's shita. So kol kohen sheshokel shemevi shikol lishka be'adar, right, again, contributing to the machatzit hashekel, eino choteh, says Rashi. What does that mean? Midika amar eino choteh miklal delechatchila lo mechayev, right, they don't have to. V'tama mefaresh b'masechet shekalim, dichtiv kol ha'over al ha'pikudim v'shevet levi lo nifkad. So the reasoning behind Ben Buchri's shita, right, is explained in Masechet Shekalim that it's based on this pasuk that says who's contributing machatzit hashekel, kol ha'uver al ha'pikudim, right? And everyone who was sort of included in this in the census, right? Shevet Levi was not part of the census in the earlier census. So that's why they're not included, right? The machatzit hashekel is connected essentially to and inextricably to the census, of which the Levi'im were not a part. Right? So now Rashi is explaining the Eino Choteh. What was my Havamina? Why would I have thought that there would have been a problem if the Cohanim are not required? Why would it have been a problem for them to contribute? One could say they're bringing chulin to the azara, right? If they're contributing money that they didn't have to contribute to, or it's not really part of the machatzit hashekel donation, and it's their money, then maybe that's bringing chulin la'azara. Right? And he says, like the Gemara is gonna explain later why it is that it's not considered a problem, despite the fact, right? But the worry theoretically is that it might be chulin la'azara. Ovadia Bar Nura is gonna explain Ben Buchri's chashash in a slightly different way. Why might I have thought that a kohen would be choteh? So right, he's not, even though he's not required to give that I might have thought that what's going to happen, these Cohanim who are not obligated to contribute are going to contribute, and then what? The korban tzibur is going to be contribute or purchased at least in part through kisafim shel yachid, and then it won't really be a korban tzibur. It'll be brought from individual finances. It'll be partially financed by individuals. Kamash malan de'ino choteh, right, comes to teach us. Ben Buchri saying that it's fine, you can do it. Lefishu hu moseroto machatzit hashekel l'tzibur legamre. It's considered to be a full bona fide contribution. It turns into kaspei tzibur, and then it's totally fine, and it's still considered to be a korban tzibur, right? So the worry for Rav Ovadia ben Bar Nura is that would be that the collective sacrifice would be considered on some level individual. Ben Buchri is coming to tell us that we're not actually worried about that. That's really the question with regard to Ben Buchri's shita. And when he says eino choteh, what's his worry? Is his worry, as Rashi says, bringing chulin la'azara, or is his worry, as Bar Nura says, right, that the korban tzibur would be karev mishel yachid? On the other hand, let's look to the other side of the Mishnah, to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's shita, and try to understand what's going on there. So kol kohen she'eino shokel choteh. This is what Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says. Rashi, and he explains here, kind of brings the explanation brought in Masechet Shekalim. Bishkalim mefarish tama dichtiv ze yitnu. Right, that we have a pasuk that says ze yitnu about the machatzit hashekel. Ze b'gematria shnei masar shvatim v'hainu shevet Levi. So ze in gematria is 12. We've got 12 shvatim, then it must include shevet Levi. V'chol ha'uver mefarish hatam kol ha'uver b'yam su. So now, what do we do with the kol ha'uver al pekudim, which was Ben Buchri's reason for excluding them? Kol ha'uver doesn't necessarily mean people who were actually included in the census. It means anyone who crossed. What crossing happens? Kol ha'uver b'yam su. All of Am Yisrael, all of whom crossed the Yam Suf, they're all included. So Rashi's kind of explanation of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is that ultimately the Cohanim do have to contribute because of these various drashot that we know about from Shekalim, on Psukim, Gematria, and the Kol HaOver. The Rambam says something slightly different, right? He says כי הדעת נותן שכל ישראל חייבים לשקול לפי שהוא כופר נפש. Right? The Rambam is saying, the drashot aside, it's obvious, it's pashut why it should be the case that Cohanim should contribute, because the machatzit shekel is on some level like kofer nefesh, a ransom, a kind of self ransom, which is to say we're kind of contributing of ourselves for the purposes of the korbanot of the mikdash. Of course, all of Am Yisrael, none of Am Yisrael should be excluded from that. ועל דרך צחות ליצה אמר, ראית כי מה שאמר השם יתברך זה ייתנו, זה בגמטריה 12, רוצה לומר כי 12 שבטים כולם הם חייבים לשקול. So it's right, he brings these drashot, but he says that these drashot are derech tzachut. They're not really the reason. The reason is obvious. They're little kind of pieces of additional support. It's right, sort of by the way. That we can learn this deen from these various psukim, but fundamentally the obligation for the Kohanim to contribute is just a simple sevara. Tosafot kind of broadens the picture a little bit and just deepens the conversation a bit. He's going to explain both of the shitot. So kol kohen sheshokel enochotai, this is Ben Buchri's shita, leven Buchri afilu levi'im pturim kemo Kohanim. So one of the things that Tosafot is adding here is just a kind of corollary or a ramification of Ben Buchri's shita, which is, we know that Ben Buchri says they're not included. Why? Because of kol ha'over al ha'pekudim. But Shevet Levi in its entirety was not included. Not merely the Kohanim, all of Shevet Levi was excluded. So theoretically, for Ben Buchri, it's all of Shevet Levi that wouldn't have to give to machatzit hashekel. So he, right, going back to the drasha that Rashi quoted, he thinks that kol ha'over means anyone who crossed the Yam Suf. Me'et kikar ve'elef v'tish'a hainu li'trumat ha'adanim. D'shalosh trumot hayu k'de mefarish b'kuntris b'parashat Yisa uve'ota shel ha'adanim lo haya shevet Levi. Okay. So right now he is explaining that for Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai, who says that Shevet Levi and the Kohanim are included, that we know that there was at least something to which the Leviim did not contribute, right? They weren't counted in the census in Sefer Shemot, and therefore we have to sort of explain that. Right, so what does it mean that they weren't kind of contributing to the machatzit hashekel for the census in Sefer Shemot? Tosafot notes here that there were several different machatzit hashekels and several different trumot, shalosh trumot hayu, as Rashi explains on Parashat Kitisa. One was trumat ha'adanim, right? The first contribution of machatzit hashekel before the building of the Mishkan was for the adanim, the kind of base. The bases or the initial architectural elements of the Mishkan. One was the later machatzit hashekel, which ultimately ended up kind of being the paradigm for the machatzit hashekel that Bnei Yisrael would give every year in the time of the Mikdash. That was the machatzit hashekel brought for the korbanot, and the final one was the trumot that were sort of brought as volunteer contributions at the end. So the Leviim, who were not counted in Sefer Shemot, what does that mean? They weren't contributing to the Trumat HaAdanim. But for the Truma, for the Korbanot, they did bring machatzit hashekel, or they did contribute to machatzit hashekel. So be'ota shel ha'adanim lo haya shevet Levi, aval be'ota shel tzorech korbanot hayu. Right, the machatzit hashekel that they were, and therefore kind of the machatzit hashekel that they were bringing for the korbanot themselves, the Leviim were there, the Kohanim were there. Right now it makes sense that kol ha'over refers to kol ha'over b'yam suf, anyone who crossed Yam Suf, everyone contributed. And then when it says kol ha'over al ha'pekudim, aka not including the Leviim, that's about specifically the Trumat HaAdanim, that first machatzit hashekel from which they were excluded. Umihu Belav hachi yesh lefaresh kol ha'over al hapekudim shenifkedu bein levadam bein im Yisrael. And Tosafot just sort of adds here, even without that, we could have explained that kol ha'over al hapekudim doesn't refer to only to people who were counted in the census along with Bnei Yisrael, but they were, right, the Levi'im were counted on their own. So that anyone who was counted, whether or not along with Bnei Yisrael or whether on their own, maybe could be contributing to machatzit hashekel for for the future. So Tosafot right here, just to summarize really quick, giving us a picture of the corollary of Ben Buchri's shita that all of Shevet Levi would be excluded, and that explaining a little bit in Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai that actually there might have been a distinction between the various different trumot in the Torah, some of which the Levi'im were a part and some of which they were not, and that the precursor to the truma, to the machatzit hashekel that Bnei Yisrael would give every year, that included Shevet Levi and the Cohanim. So let's, with all of that kind of under our belts, I think what we're going to do next is try to understand what it is that, right, on the one hand, we saw that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai disagrees with the drasha that the Cohanim were making for themselves. But on the other hand, it seems like a pretty good point. So the question is, right, how might we respond to the claim of the Cohanim that if they give or contribute to machatzit hashekel, then every communal mincha would need to be burned in its entirety, right? How could it be that lechem hapanim and the omer could possibly be eaten? So how are we going to respond to that question? And we're going to see that a couple of different answers here might paint slightly different pictures about what communal korbanot are, and in light of that, what the community really is. So Rashi on Erchlin here explains, L'didan letlan hachdrasha dehai kalil tihyeh b'minchat kohen greda katuv aval b'minchat tzibbur zil bataruba. So for us, which is to say, how do we paskin, right? According to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, we don't have to worry about the drasha of kalil tihyeh that the Kohanim seem to be worried about, because kalil tihyeh b'minchat kohen greda katuv. It's meant about a mincha that actually belongs specifically to a kohen, just to a kohen. Avad b'minchat tzibbur, but when it comes to a communal mincha, zil bataruba, we follow the majority. The majority of Am Yisrael contributing funds to this pot of funds are not in fact Kohanim, and therefore we can follow the majority. It's not considered a minchat kohen, and therefore it can be eaten. So the mincha of a kohen must be burned, but a communal mincha is not considered a minchat kohen, even if the Kohanim are contributing, because we follow the majority, and the majority are not Kohanim. But the Avnei Nezer, who's also the author of the Eglei Tal, the Stugachover, Rav Avraham Bornstein, I believe is his name, comes to with a slightly different angle, and explains something that I think paints a slightly different picture of the nature of a tzibbur. I'll just sort of skip to the end. Why is it the case that we don't have to worry about the financial contributions of Kohanim, even if we're going to eat these menachot? Even though he has a chelek or a portion in the korban tzibbur, right, he financially contributed. Right, it's not the case that he has an individual, right? He has a portion, right? That let's say the Cohanim contributed to 7% of the funds. These aren't 7%. These menachot aren't 7% menachot of Kohen. Merely, it's the case that he has some kind of portion within this new entity called the klal, right? The community. Right, so the communal korbanot here are not considered to belong to the individuals who donated the machatzit hashekel. Rather, they belong to this new entity called the klal, the community, which it's true that they came together to create, but that entity is independent, and that entity isn't an entity that's 7% kohen. It's a new entity, and it doesn't have the status of kehuna even in part. So this is actually going to bring us into a slightly different question. There's an interesting halakhic debate that also rests on this question of contributing to the machatzit hashekel, and I think we can see in it echoes of a similar question, which is how do we think about contributing to machatzit hashekel as being part of a community, and how do we think about what is that community that is created out of those individual contributions? That question is going to be the question of the requirement of women to daven musaf, right? The korban musaf, or was one of the communal korbanot purchased out of this communal pot. Women obviously didn't contribute to the machatzit hashekel, right? Only males aged 20 and up would contribute to machatzit hashekel, and therefore the question is going to become: are women considered to have a part of this collective entity that is bringing the korban tzibbur, and therefore will that have ramifications nowadays for whether women are chayav to daven musaf? Just as a little bit of context, right? Women are, pshat in the Mishnah, women are chayavot b'tfilah. The way that's kind of understood by the later authorities in the Achronim, certainly shacharit, almost definitely musaf as well, and according to many poskim also marv. But then there's a slightly the question about korban musaf takes a slightly different shape, because women's chiyuv in the kind of general daily tefillot comes from the idea that tefillah rachameninhu, right? Despite the fact that it mitzvah seishazman grama, it's called rachamim in Chazal, and therefore women are considered to have a part in that. But the korban musaf specifically is a takana that based on this particular korban. So the question of the women's sense of participation in this collective korban is going to maybe have ramifications for her chiyuv in tefillah. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger, so he takes a hard line and says the women are actually pturot. Why? Right, because the women didn't contribute machatzit hashekel, right? Then they don't have a halakhic in the korban of the tzibbur, and because they don't have a halakhic in the korban of the tzibbur, they should be exempt from musaf, right? It's a sort of simple straight line. That's Rabbi Akiva Eiger's position. But Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector makes a different argument, right? In his Shut Be'er Yitzchak, makes a different argument, and based on some of the ideas that we've already been throwing around over the past little while. So what does he say? Right, he's writing about what Rabbi Akiva Eiger said here. Lo nigirli. This doesn't make sense to me. Why? לפי מאי דאיתא במנחות. דאמר רבי יהודה, העיד בן בוכרי ביבנה, כל כהן ששוקל אינו חוטא. כי על פי דין פטורים הם המשקלים, וכמו כן לוויים, וכן קטנים הפחותים מבין 20 דפטורים. So first of all, he's saying, wait a second. If we want to exclude women because they don't bring machatzit hashekel, then there's going to be a whole lot of other people who are going to have to exclude from tfilat musaf, including, according to the position of Ben Bukhari, all of Shevet Levi. That's number one. And number two, what about men from ages 13 to 20 who also aren't contributing machatzit hashekel but are chayav and mitzvot? And right, atu Cohanim leviim uktanim b'chutim miben esrim b'paturim musaf. Do we really want to say that leviim, Cohanim, and anyone under the age of 20 is patured from davening musaf? That can't be. Maybe it's a little bit different with kids, right? The teenagers, really, they're not actually children, but because they will ultimately end up contributing to the machatzit hashekel, right? It would still be a problem for Cohanim Leviim, at least according to Ben Bukhri's shita. And I think Respector is saying it can't be that Ben Bukhri, right? Even though we don't paskin that, and in the end, right, it would be implausible to think that Ben Bukhri would think that all of Shevet Levi wouldn't have to daven musaf. No, it must be that the tefillah of musaf is not dependent on whether or not this individual would have been contributing machatzit hashekel and contributing to the funds of korbanot tzibur. Women are obligated in musaf, he says, despite not having contributed machatzit hashekel. Because why? Because they're still part of this tzibur. It's true that the collective pot of the tzibur those contributions only come from some of the from some of the people who make up the tzibbur, but that doesn't mean that the tzibbur is only made up of the people who are actually contributing the funds. The tzibbur itself is a broader collective that includes certain Cohanim and Leviim, even for Ben Bukhari, includes children and includes women, says Respecter. So just to kind of summarize a little bit and see how these positions might align with one another. In some ways, it's sort of the reverse. On the one hand, right, when it comes to the Cohanim and the Leviim and the machloket that we saw between Rashi and the Avnei Nezer about that even if I do contribute, says the Avnei Nezer, the collective has an identity independent of me, right? So too, in the reverse, says Respecter, that even if I don't contribute, the collective has an identity independent of me, but of which I can consider myself a part. And right, I can not have been an individual contributor to this collective and still be a part of the collective in a different way because that collective has a different identity. So just to sort of see how these positions line up, right? If in the top here, right, I'm kind of following Rashi and Rabbi Akiva Eger's logic, right? Imagining that a community is really just a composite of individuals, and therefore a minchat tzibbur can be eaten because we follow the majority. And as Rabbi Akiva Eger says, women would be exempt from musaf because they didn't themselves contribute to machatzit hashekel. An interesting kind of possible ramification of this line of thinking might be going back to minchat tzibbur, that if somehow a communal mincha was purchased with majority Kohen funds, then it would have to be burned. We wouldn't be able to eat it. On the other hand, right, and I'm at the bottom here now, right, if you think like what the Avnei Nezer says, that a community is a new and independent entity, right, independent of the individuals who make it up, then a minchat tzibbur can be eaten not because of this rove, not because of the majority, just because it belongs to the community and not to the Cohanim per se at all. And on the other hand, women might be obligated to that musaf simply because they're a part of the community despite not having contributed as individuals to the collective pot of funds. And again, sort of the ramification of this is that even if even if a communal mincha was purchased with majority Kohen funds, it could still be eaten. And right, because ultimately, according to this sort of line of thinking, this communal pot of funds and ultimately the community itself, right, isn't just the sum of its parts, but is actually something independent and new, created by all of us together, whether we're financial contributors to it or not. Thanks so much, and have a great week.